Welcome to the 14th episode of Regulate Tech, and this is a classics episode where we'll look back at one of the classic texts with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and
me, Richard Allan.
Well, Richard, I think for us, it would be mysterious if somebody said that they hadn't read anything by Lawrence Lessig. But I'm not sure that a lot of people read Lessig today. I'm not sure that that's sort of part of the diet if you are a young up and coming tech policy professional. There's so much else to read, so I'm not faulting people. But I think there's some value in going back to these classics. So why don't you tell us a little bit about who Lawrence Lessig was?
Yeah. So at the time.
He's still alive.
Yeah, I mean,
to be very clear.
I mean, we just need to. I think important to put it into sort of time context. So, again, very easy to forget this now, but until 1991, the internet was an entirely sort of private academic network. It wasn't available for people to use commercially. And then 1991, if you like, the doors were thrown open. And this book, the one that we're going to talk about today, Code, was written in 1999. So it's a very early phase when the internet was going from being a kind of boring academic tool, if you like, where we're just there weren't any issues. It's just a thing that academics use. It's like you don't discuss, large hadron colliders or things that are used in academia that are not sort of policy or legal questions, really. And then sort of in the 1990s, the internet was being opened up and all of these questions arose. And really, Larry Lessig was one of the first legal academics to actually say, hey, there's something really interesting happening here. There's going to be some really big questions that have to be answered. And he really brought the sort of discipline of somebody who understands, in particular, the American legal code. But what's nice about the book is he sort of translates it into concepts that I think work everywhere. But he really, really understands US law and takes that and in an academic context with a bunch of co-collaborators. And if you look at the names of them, many of them have gone on themselves to do great things, the researchers who worked on this, to really dig in and perhaps come up for the first time with a sort of forward-looking analysis and framework for how the law might be the same or might be different when applied to this internet that was moving from being, as I say, sort of dull academic tool to something that now we know is central to our lives, all aspects of our lives.
Yes, and I think it's relevant also to remember that Lawrence Lessig came to internet law, or the question of internet regulation, from constitutional law. That was his background. And I think that constitutional law, especially in the US, is this fundamental layer of the stack, if you want, right? So he could see the similarities between law and code, as he goes on to talk about, quite clearly from his constitutional perspective. And I think it matters when you read code to remember, and he points this out at several places too, that he was originally and first and foremost a constitutional scholar, and he has gone on to do a lot of work around corruption, etc., when he left tech policy proper. And I think, to me, when I read code now, it's even more obvious to me that this is a constitutional scholar writing about regulation, rather than, say, an intellectual property expert or somebody who's an expert in contract law might have approached the issue completely differently. And so, if we sort of move to the book, then what is the world in which this book is written? What's the ontology that underlies what Lawrence Lessig is trying to do here? I mean, I'll give you a hypothesis. I think he's a dualist still. A lot of the early internet theoreticians were dualists. They thought of cyberspace as a separate place that could be protected or attacked or corrupted, and then the real world as a separate place. That dualism, I feel, is really one of the core precepts in Lessig's philosophy. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right, because I think there is this sense, again, as you read through, that cyberspace is this wonderful new thing we've created. And he interesting actually sort of points out that the cyber word is interesting because it comes from cybernetics, which itself sort of implies control. So there's sort of something about the language he sort of points to. But I still think there's a golden thread that runs through of this idea of we've created something new that must be protected. And the almost the applying the law and regulation is dangerous. and therefore the sort of, I think the intellectual ferment at the time, and we've talked again about John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence in cyberspace. I think that he has sort of absorbed that sort of sense of the risk is of people applying regulation to this space and then doing sort of ruining it, spoiling it for everybody, with this idea that it is a separate space. And so I think that is absolutely in the sort of mid-90s, the prevailing thinking is this sort of, can we create something that is new and different and sits outside? And as we dig into the different forces he applies, I think for me, one of the really interesting things is the extent to which people, the public, actually sort of rejected that model and want the law to be applied, to the internet. There's a sort of classic phrase that people keep using: what's illegal offline should be illegal online, etc. And the flip side, what's legal offline should be legal online. We can sort of look at both of those, but the key point being that I think there was an assumption in the mid-90s that we could somehow create something different, and the danger, the risk, the enemy was applying old school regulation. I think when we sit here in 2021, there's a lot more concern about the lack of applying traditional law to the internet than the fact that it's not there.
Yeah, and it's strong. I mean, it is perhaps even stronger in John Perry Barlow in '96 when he writes the Independence Declaration that we've talked about several times. But it's strong even in Lessig, and it then returns later in one of Lessig's followers, Citrain, when he talks about the future of the internet and how to stop it. There is, in this early tech policy phase, there's this governing macro narrative that almost reminds you of Paradise Lost.
Yes.
It's this sense that you have a pristine virgin territory that is now getting encroached upon by commerce forces, by government forces, etc. And Lessig sort of sets out how he thinks that this new space is going to be regulated, because he's moved past Barlow. He doesn't believe anymore that you can set up the boundaries and say, you weary giants of flesh and steel, stay away. He doesn't believe in the Barlovian sort of rejection of authority, but he thinks still that there is a way to limit and almost design the kind of regulation that the internet will be under in order to protect it. And then of course, he will specifically single out one strand of legislation that he thinks encroaches on this space, and spend many years of his active career combating what he feels is overreach from the copyright holders, and specifically discuss copyright as a core impediment for the kind of freedom to think, to remix, etc. that cyberspace contains. But returning to code, then he has this modeling code of regulation that's become, I think, more or less iconic, and most of the people who were around at the time unconsciously still apply it. It's not entirely new, but I think it's been enormously influential. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so he creates this, again, a little bit of dualism, this sort of opposition between East Coast code, as in US terms, and West Coast code. So essentially, the East Coast code being the traditional legal way of doing things, and West Coast code being the new Silicon Valley or internet way of doing things. And so he creates a sort of opposition between those two models. And it's kind of pretty apparent as you read it that the West Coast one is cooler, but more complex and more difficult. and then within that, he sort of tries to identify four different forces that actually then frame the rules that we apply. So instead of regulation being something that a parliament or a congress or somebody sort of writes and applies, which is a sort of pretty unidimensional way of directing things, he has these four dimensions that he sees as pushing on things. So there is still the traditional law. Lawmakers will write law, and that will have an impact. He pulls out norms, which actually I find the most interesting one of all of these. So what's people's expectations? What are they expecting the internet? How do they expect it to work? What do they expect it to do? Then he looks at market forces. And again, I think interesting when you sort of look at it there, that there's an assumption that market forces are new and are entering into the scene at this stage. And today, actually, if you look at most of the discussion that we have, it's based on an assumption like surveillance capitalism. All of this is based on an assumption that the market has utterly corrupted the internet, and market forces are driving it in negative directions. And then the last one is architecture, which is the code itself. How are things built? So he's gone from saying, look, how behavior will work is based on there's a law. Although, as anyone who sort of works in politics knows, laws rarely actually change behavior. They sort of prohibit things that don't necessarily mean that people behave very differently. But that's the traditional model, the legal model, East Coast law, East Coast code, off we go, we do that. And then this new model where these four forces maybe pulling in the same direction or maybe pulling in different directions, but depending on the mix of law, norms, architecture and market forces, you will get some kind of settlement. And I think that, I certainly found out in 1999 when this came out, I was newly elected. I was elected in 97 to the UK Parliament, and I was sort of trying to find frameworks for how we deal with stuff. And it seemed really obvious to me that it wasn't just like you pass a law and it'll work. And so this model, this more complex, richer model was like hugely helpful in trying to think things through and trying to understand what's actually happening, as opposed to the theoretical model of legislators where, we pass a law, everything changes, is the sort of classic model that you work to.
Yeah, I agree. I first read it I was actually in Menlo Park at the time, working for the Swedish Office of Science and Technology, and bought it at Kepler's, which is a local bookstore there. I remember reading it, sitting outside in the sunshine with a coffee and just being blown away. I thought it was, I really, I hadn't read a lot about regulatory theory, etc., but I thought it was profound. And this notion that what he was trying to do was also to reveal code and architecture as a prime regulator, that he wanted to sort of bring it into the open, that the way we design our architecture, the way we design the code, and he then thought that it would be influenced by commercial forces, as you say, and that those would corrupt the design, it really has a regulatory effect. Market law and norms were fairly well known. If you'd sort of gone to law school, you were familiar with that way of thinking. But he was trying to bring in code and architecture and show how it really had this regulatory effect. And it's interesting because when you then start to sort of trace or track or look at the history of ideas here, this is not a new idea. He is applying, and he references this. He's applying an old tradition that goes back to people like Langdon Winner, who wrote this epic paper called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" Which is it's a brilliant piece in which he sort of goes through how architecture and artifacts can really restrict, and he uses this, I think, the most well-known example of all in the science of technology studies. Is the bridges or the underpasses to the beaches in New York designed to not admit buses, which meant that you could effectively discriminate by having these low underpasses so that nobody who was poor, and this was often African Americans, could go to the beaches because the buses just couldn't pass under those underpasses. And sort of you can see how he sort of reaches back at this, and he talks about architecture and code and then tries to bring that in. And it is a bit of a revelatory sort of expose of, look, all of this code that's underpinning the internet actually also is regulating you. And I think that's remained. That's sort of a theme that we're now facing when we talk about algorithmic complexity or algorithmic regulation or transparency. And so that early heuristics of suspicion that sort of Lessig introduces is actually one of the strongest, I would argue, legacies that he's left behind. This notion that there is something in that code that's regulating me. I need to know what it is. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you're right. The interesting thing is, I think many of the Silicon Valley people would be technological determinists. They kind of we've built this technology. It is unregulatable by design. And therefore, like, governments back off. The technology will win, and this is never going to be regulated. And I think what Lessig did nicely was sort of bring a sense of that in, but sort of temper it. So he is absolutely saying, yes, the code matters, the way you build things matter, but not as a technological determinist to say, well, that's it, that's the end of the story. You've built it this way, and job done. He's nicely sort of marrying that and saying, it is really important, but these other forces equally are important, and they all interact on each other. And so the way that you build the code and this is the bit I find fascinating. I think that the way that code is built frequently reflects norms to a greater degree than people think. And actually, sometimes it also very, specifically reflects laws. So that takes us away. In a true technological determinist world, you would where code is supreme, you would kind of go, well, we can just ignore, all of the norms and laws and build what we want. But that's not the case. I think they're all interacting on each other. And I think you're absolutely right that the sense that the market, there's all these different dimensions going on. There's norms and code. so companies are writing code to do things that people want in the way that they want to do them. There's market and code. People are writing code in order to make money, frankly, and build businesses that will be successful. And then all of these will interact with each other. But you're right. I think today we're very focused on the market code dimension. You have coded this in order to make more money. And perhaps sometimes at the extent of losing some of these other dimensions that are taking place between all of these four forces. That market code dimension is the one that is critical. And the assumption is, algorithms are driven entirely by market demands. And therefore, if we can look at the algorithm, it's going to reveal that. As I say, certainly in my experience, I think that the user norms, consumer norms, are a sort of hugely powerful force on the way in which those algorithms are written. Sometimes they may coincide with the market forces. Other times they may not. They may conflict with the market forces. But it's all of them that we need to look at. Interesting. We're sitting here talking about it today, and maybe it is time to come back and say, let's actually look at some of the problems we're talking about and on the episodes of this podcast in those dimensions, and that framework, that ability to say, let's look at these four forces and weigh them up. Given that all of them are probably acting on a particular problem at a particular time, none of them are exclusive. But on privacy and data use, how is the law impacting on decisions that companies are making versus norms, versus market forces, versus requirements that the code has or architectures that are workable or not workable?
I think it's also interesting when you look at the sort of the four regulators. Another dimension that sort of has been brought out in later discussions that I think is worthwhile thinking about is, how are these rules or how are these regulators produced? Because there's only one of them that's actually produced under democratic conditions by elected officials, and that's law. Yes. It's kind of a bleak picture that he's painting because it's only one single regulator that's democratically decided upon and shaped. If you look at all of the others, though, if you look at norms, markets, and code, they're all produced in ways that are not open to democratic process. We don't vote on what code to use or what norms we have. We don't vote on prices. But there's an interesting difference between markets and norms and code. And that is that markets and norms are highly decentralized. There's if you have a competitive market, and that's the sort of the base example, prices will be set on the basis of supply and demand. It's not going to be any one person who has influence over that. There's no power concentration. Norms, same thing. Norms are extremely decentralized. It's really hard for a single individual to decide that I will now set a norm. That's sort of, you have to be either an influencer, as they're called nowadays, or somebody who is sort of a pop star or somebody to have that normative power. But code is different. Because code in Lessig's analysis, and I'd like to challenge this, code in his analysis has a single producer who makes conscious choices about how that architecture will be designed. But if you wanted to just complicate Lessig's theory a little bit and make it more interesting, you could argue that it's not code, it's codes in the plural. It's architectures in the plural that are competing with each other. And so in reality, code is not as open to control as he suggests, because it's also something that happens in a decentralized way, where different kinds of architectures, open source versus proprietary code, walled gardens versus open ecosystems, where there is sort of a great deal of decentralized coordination too. What do you think?
So yes, it is decentralized, but there are examples of where through law and markets to an extent, governments have tried to direct how the code is written. Now, I think the standout example is is technically called the e-privacy directive, and it's known as the cookie law. But this is very deliberate. So anyone who uses the internet in the European Union will be familiar with this, that when they visit websites, these boxes pop up asking them for various permissions related to cookies, these bits of code that are put on your computer when you frequently visit websites. And that was very explicit, that a law was passed to say you must write your code in this way. You must write code. You can't choose your architecture of how you want to deal with cookies anymore. You've got to write it in a particular way, and the law is actually very detailed, and there's been a bunch of court cases that sort of added to that. And so you have law dictating code there quite explicitly. Market is pulling in the opposite direction. Market is sort of pulling towards, or market force towards, having more cookies because they're part of the money making machine. And I think norms in that example are quite interesting. The norms are, certainly this is my experience, I think most people's, you just click straight through these things and you don't care about them or find them, you don't find them helpful. If anything, you find them kind of annoying. I think that's the experience of most people. So I think, again, these concrete examples where you pull it out and you can look at the four forces sort of acting there. Law telling you how to build your architecture. And there are other examples where this may happen. For example, there's an ongoing debate about whether companies should be able to use end-to-end encryption in their services. Now, if you pass a law prohibiting end-to-end encryption, that is very explicitly legally regulating the architecture, the code. And so it is an attempt, actually, to your point, Nicklas, to get past that decentralization. It's sort of, oh my God, end-to-end encrypted services popping up everywhere, cookies are popping up everywhere. We're finding it difficult to control it. Norms are not controlling it because people seem to be okay with these things. So we will pass a law that explicitly tries to sort of pull all the code, all the architectures into some kind of common legislative framework. So I think there are, I'd say, examples where law aims to dictate the limits of code. You can go so far. Yes, you can use cookies, but if you're going to use them, here's some things, very specific things that you must do. And in the case of something like end-to-end encryption, some of the pros are, yes, you can use it, but if you do, you must offer a backdoor to the security services. So again, a very sort of explicit direction of how to architect an end-to-end encrypted service.
And I think you also put your finger on something else that's really important there, and that is the choice of regulator. If you're sort of looking at a situation and you want to figure out how to regulate it, the choice will really impact all of the different regulators and how they work also in the other direction. Lessig is focused on how these four regulate a specific object of regulation, but the use of any one of them actually then also spills over back. So to your point about the e-privacy directive, what happens is that there is a law mandating a certain kind of notification that leads to an erosion of the norm. You should really take care of what you do or what you click on the web. So these regulators are weakened or strengthened by the way that they're used in concert, the way that they're combined in different ways. So in the case of the cookie law, the normative strength, the normative role in regulating privacy is actually weakened by law trying to specifically tell you how to write your code. I think this is underestimated too, and part of the sort of the discussion that needs to happen post Lessig, I think, is, look, this is not four arrows pointing to a center. This is a network of pressures in society, and depending on how we invest in a portfolio model, we will create different regulatory outcomes. And if there's anything, I think, I mean, the simple sort of the simplified but also simplistic model that he uses was extraordinarily powerful, and because of that reason, I think maybe obscured some of the complexities, the network character of the regulation we're facing. But he was also, there's interesting because he has issued his book in a couple of different versions, and one he actually discusses this, and he discusses the question of the lack of democracy when it comes to the design of code. And he says that we never have a public debate about how to design code, and seems to first lament this fact and then say that that's a peculiarity with code, that we just can't discuss how it's designed. But yet you're saying that's what we're doing, right?
I think we do, and I think in a sense, quite a lot of code is private law, sort of made by the companies in response to pressures, norms from their user bases. And yes, it's not democratic in the sense it's not been made by a legislative body, but there is some small d democracy going on where a company is responding to pressure. And take another concrete example, where I think the forces are more closely aligned. It's on terrorist content, certainly in the US and Western Europe, where I think the norms of the public are to be horrified by the idea that major platforms would be carrying content that promotes or supports the kind of terrorists who've been attacking their societies. The companies have responded. They've changed their code in many cases, for example, to implement systems that will automatically catch ISIS or an Al-Qaeda video and make sure it doesn't get redistributed. There's been some market forces that certainly advertisers who use those platforms are very keen to make sure that the platforms remove that kind of content. And then law, in a sense, has sort of been following up, tracking this closely, not out of step, but tracking it, so that you have bodies like the European Union who are now proposing sort of anti-terrorism or anti-terrorist content legislation that essentially would sort of make legal that which is already happening on the platforms, these sort of super fast removals of flagged terrorist content. So there, I think that's an interesting example where I think all four forces are pulling in the same direction, and where the private law, the private code of the companies, is ahead of the public law, but not misaligned with it. It's the same democratic pressure, the pressure that citizens are putting on their governments and that citizens are putting on the companies is aligned, and so also for are moving in step. So I think again we can look at examples where yes, you can say on paper, the law is not the thing that's driving this, and therefore there's a democratic deficit. But in terms of people's understanding of what's going on, it's actually quite positive. And again, just another example that has been long debated is there's a body called the Internet Watch Foundation in the UK. And the Internet Watch Foundation receives reports of child abuse material and passes those to platforms to get rid of it. And again, that's never been set up in law. It's an industry-run body. Effectively, the industry funds it, but government supports it. Government gives it its blessing. And we've had long debates over the years about, is that appropriate? Is it right that this is a private body and it's not the law? Well, it works. And so sometimes you have these solutions that work really well. I think there is strong public support for them, but they haven't been legislated for. And I think that's different from the scenario which I think a lot of legal scholars worry about, which is the code is doing something that people actively don't want. It's actually acting against the norms and their interests, typically for market reasons. And that, I understand the democratic deficit there. I would question, the extent to which we should feel this is a terrible democratic deficit. Where there is alignment, it's just that the law, for whatever reason, has not caught up with what's actually taking place.
I like this. I think you're describing a really interesting dynamic system. And I think one of the hypotheses you could extract from what you're saying is that you can say, look, we have code, law, market, and norms. And the way societies work is that they will actually seek an equilibrium in which none of these are dominant. So if one of them is dominant, if it's code that regulates the situation to 80%, that will make people a little bit iffy, and they will look to get influence for norms, markets, and they will probably use law to get it. So you get a situation where this particular technology might be regulated at a much more equal basis. It's not 80% code, it's 20% code, it's perhaps 30% law, and you can go on and then sort of imagine the equilibrium. And one sort of general theory you can extract from your reading of Lessig there is that that the way that tech policy will unfold, the way the legislative discussions will unfold, is to create more of an equilibrium between the regulatory forces so that no single regulatory force is dominant in the end. And if that's the case, I think that sort of explains, and if you look through that lens, you can see at the artificial intelligence debate, where it's felt that around 90% of the regulatory effect and agency is actually in the technology. And there's very little legal or market or norms influence over how artificial intelligence actually evolves. And the debate we're in currently is how can we then move towards an equilibrium where there's more influence from the other regulatory forces. Do you think that's right?
I think it is. I think there is a temptation with every new technology to assume technological dominance that then erodes over time. And actually in Lessig's book, he talks about a fear that the copyright lobby would manage to implement code or force code to be implemented that controls every single use of copyrighted content. And for him, that's a nightmarish negative scenario. And there was at that time, remember, the debate about different chips that would be used for protection. We've talked before about this sort of mass push for code-based or architectural digital rights protection. And that hasn't materialized, and we've discussed this in one of our other episodes, in quite that way. It's been much more sort of give and take, and a much more scope for people to follow the norms, follow the behaviors they want to follow, albeit with new mechanisms for providing compensation to rights holders. So it's sort of evolved more comprehensively. I actually think the same is going to happen with artificial intelligence. So the classic example in artificial intelligence that people are concerned around is discrimination between different demographic groups. I think it's absolutely right. It's a legitimate concern. But it's one that could be tempered by norms and law working together. So if, for example, it's that you run a recruitment service and your recruitment service is continually discriminating against people from particular backgrounds when they're being put forward for jobs, if the public norm is we don't like that, we find that discriminatory, we're hostile to it. If the market force from employers is, hey, I'm really concerned that I'm getting now criticized because I'm using your service and your service appears to be discriminatory. If that pressure builds up, it's perfectly possible to pass a law which would penalize those who implement discriminatory algorithmically chosen candidates. It doesn't mean you're necessarily regulating the algorithm per se, but you're regulating the outputs of the algorithm, which is something that should be demonstrable. And so, again, the regulator come in and say, look, we're going to put in 50 people with different names and different backgrounds into your system. And if the result of that, the selection process looks discriminatory, you've got a problem and you're going to have to go and rewrite your algorithm. So I actually think a lot of the AI effects or the negative effects will get sorted out that way through norms, market forces, and then they may be sufficient. You may not need the law in the end if those are there. If employers are refusing to use a recruitment service that can't demonstrate that its algorithms are not being discriminatory, then that's in itself going to be a massively powerful regulator or driver on the algorithm. But ultimately, I think there may also be quite a lot of push towards law. And so it may look more like the example I've given of the terrorism content where, if society is aligned, then there'll be a lot of solutions found, and then legislation will effectively put right those solutions that are already in the market into law and make them the standard.
And I think if you adopt this as a dynamic model, then it seems quite natural to argue that in the beginning, when you introduce a new technology, the way that technology regulates or affects society is going to be, to a dominant part, it's going to be in the design of the architecture of that technology, because that's what new technology means. We haven't seen it before. We haven't had the time to form norms, market behaviors, or laws around it. Then you sort of end up in a really interesting and somewhat simplified model of what it is that you do as a tech policy professional. Because as a tech policy professional, you have this new technology coming in, you want to make sure that it's not regulated to smithereens. So your first argument is going to go, well, I think the market will sort this out. Or, we'll have self-regulation. That's norms, right?
Yes.
So you're sort of arguing for a sequence in which you balance this new technology out with the other regulators. Essentially, your first sort of basic line of argument is going to be, I know the market will sort this out, and then if that doesn't work, well, we'll set up self-regulatory institutions that will work as norms to sort this out, and then at the end, whatever spillover you're not able to manage, or where there's sort of still a lot of regulatory capacity in that technology, legislators are going to step in and say, you know what, there's going to be law regulating the situation as well. And it sort of, it neatly gives you another model of how the job is done.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, from and again, this is the popular perception is that people who work for tech companies who are threatened with regulation, their job is to say no repeatedly and forcefully. And you're right. In many cases, that is actually true, because when the technology is nascent, you fear that early regulation would stop the technology growing. Again, if we look back at our cookie example, and people have different views about whether they do or don't like cookies, but if that regulation had come in right at the beginning, the cookie technology would never have taken off. It would have been too painful. As it was kind of bolted on quite a long way later. And so people are taking the pain of putting up these banners and clicking through them because the technology is established and is actually useful, at the same time as exploring, future alternatives. But that would be an example to say if the and maybe the legislators would have preferred that if the day that cookies had been invented and started being used, somebody had come in with a regulation like that, it would have killed the technology right at the beginning. And so again, from tech company point of view, that is your biggest concern, that you've built something, you think it's good, and the regulation will stop it. Now, it does open up the question, I think is a question sort of runs through politics generally, which is, look, how many mistakes and how serious do those mistakes need to be before the law catches up? How dangerous is something? Again, the cookie example might be one, that there will be people, I'm sure listening to this, who feel that's when I described how they could have killed the technology early on with legislation, they go, damn, we missed the opportunity, because they feel that is a very sort of privacy invasive and bad technology. But in other instances, again, we look at some of the bad content that goes around. We had this awful attack that took place in New Zealand, where the terrorist live streamed the attack that took place. Again, that was a risk. I think it was a known risk that when you put a live streaming technology out, that people will use it for horrible purposes. Was that a sufficient risk to say, look, you can't offer live streaming unless and until we have some sort of legal regulated solution in place? So I think many of the questions we face in tech policy are sort of about when, not whether, something is going to be regulated. It is going to be regulated eventually. But from the company point of view, I think they'll say, please not yet, and please allow us the space to make some mistakes. And from a government point of view, and sometimes a societal point of view, it's going to be, whoa, no, those mistakes are too serious. Either you have to kind of hold back on the technology, or we're going to rush in and create a law, regulate it, even before we kind of fully understand all of the dynamics in play. You guys in the companies want to allow this to play out. We want to control it earlier on. So I think that is a classic dynamic for lots of the technologies that we've worked on.
I think that's right, and I think that you can also, as a technology company, choose a little bit how you launch your technologies, and then test them against the different regulators. One of the interesting examples there, and I think this is a minority example, but it really fascinated me, was the way Google Glass was released. Because if you looked how the sort of very conscious, I think, release plan there was to release it in small batches and have people use it and then see what the reaction was, knowing that somebody walking into a bar with a camera on their face might actually be perceived as violating norms. So there was a suspicion there that the norms...
I don't know why that would be, Nicklas. I think it feels perfectly normal.
Everyone has their mobile phone and they have cameras everywhere. Anyway, so and it ended up with, and you know this, and I've probably laughed at this, it ended up with this very clear normative signal where you could find signs in bars saying "no glass holes, please," which gave you a fairly clear normative idea of what was going on here. And so I think that that the way you release your technology actually allows you to test against the different regulators in different ways. And one of the ways in which you can sort of use Lessig today is to say, if you're working in tech policy, what you want to do is you want to explain to your principal, to your company, to the engineers at your company that, look, we have this technology, it's transformative, it has an enormous amount of social impact. The way that social impact will be moderated will really matter, but it will be moderated. And I suggest to you that we should release it in such a way that we first get a chance to moderate it with norms and then see what the market can do, as not to trigger the legal regulation too quickly. But that will come, and we should figure out what residue we really sits in the law. You can almost imagine somebody planning this out and sort of giving a visual saying, here's how we should do this. And there is, I just wanted to get back to your example. I don't think so. The cookies example is hypothetical, but there are real examples of when the legal regulator used too early actually really killed off a technology. And my favorite example is the directive on electronic signatures in the European Union, which I think, by specifying exactly how they should be used and having really rigid technical conditions, delayed the introduction of electronic signatures in the European Union by years, if not decades. And I think that the way that electronic signatures work is largely outside of the framework of that legislation as well. It just created an enormous amount of legal certainty that we couldn't do it that way. And so that was an example of how, if a technology slips, and in that case it slipped because security was felt to be so important, through all of the market and norms, and then immediately hits on legislation, that's going to be really complicated. It's interesting to contrast with the US, where they essentially said that, if you're signing with the intention of signing, it's a signature. That was the sort of the gist of the legislation there, which meant that they gave the initiative back to norms, saying, figure it out through norms. That's how we should do this. And then the market came up with a ton of solutions, and they haven't changed their Digital Signature Act or the sort of legislation around that since. So I think there's a real instructive example looking at cases like this to see how the sequence of regulators really impacts the success and reception of a technology.
Yeah, and I think another one actually in that vein is electronic identity or identity verification, which, again, Lessig talks quite a lot about in the book, and I think he's ahead of his time in sort of flagging that as a key issue. But you're right, there's another area where legislation could say thou shalt use this particular sort of expensive and difficult from a tech point of view, a form of identity. And if it does that, it may end up being counterproductive to the goal. If the goal is, stronger authentication and verification, that there are methods that people use. I think in Scandinavia, there's a lot of using bank identity systems. So right. Rather than government identity system, the bank identity systems are great. They have the wonderful advantage that you use them every day, whereas government ID you tend to use much less frequently, which is a real problem with it. But, again, to piggyback on the norm being that people are comfortable using bank ID and they can get comfortable using that secure bank ID for other services is great. If you come along with a legal solution that says, no, you must use some government identity system, which I say people use once a year to fill in their tax return and then they forget the details for the other 364 days, you're actually going to end up doing things in a counterproductive way. So I think it's really important, you're right, when the legislation is made, and crucially, whether it does take account of what's actually happening out there, as opposed to creating a sort of theoretical model that again, on paper looks more democratic. It looks more democratic to say we're going to use the government-issued ID rather than banking ID, which is private sector and maybe favors people with bank accounts, blah, blah, blah. You can see all the reasons why you might construct a democratic argument for the electronic ID. But if that is way out of step with what people are actually doing, as you described for electronic signatures, is going to end up setting you back. And better would be to figure out a way that you can build on what's out there, extend it, deal with issues of unbanked people, deal with any other issues that you've got, rather than sort of starting all over again with a legal solution that is not necessarily the optimal model.
It's interesting because if we go back to Lessig, what he argues is that he says essentially, look at these regulatory forces. Currently, code is regulating a lot of the internet and keeping it open. We should expect that with the increasing commercial importance of the internet, there will be more legislation, and that legislation will shut down the open space, this sort of new space that we have created in ways that we will not like. We need to stop that. But what we're saying is, the way we're reading Lessig now is saying that was always going to happen. Because you need to reach the state of equilibrium between the regulators. You can't have code regulating an outsized part of society, because that's not stable. That's not a stable state for society to be in. So the question is more, if you go back to Lessig, how much of this could have ended up in norms? How much of this could have ended up in markets? And how could we make sure that the legislation didn't shut down the ability to create new code? Because that's the other thing, right? This entire system, the way it works, also has an impact. And this, we get closer and closer to Jonathan Zittrain's idea of the generative internet. Also has an impact on the next innovation. If regulation is too harsh and cuts off too many different technological pathways, then what happens is that you slow down the overall pace of innovation. And this is an overused argument, saying you threaten innovation today. If you say that a piece of legislation threatens innovation today, you're getting laughed out of the room in Brussels, yes. I think, because arguably, we should sort of admit our mistakes. I think the tech industry overused that particular line of argument. But there's some truth to it too, right? That you can imagine a world in which you cut off these pathways.
I was going to say there certainly is, and again, I think it's one of these dimensions that we've teased out a few times, where there's a transatlantic cultural divergence. In that, I certainly get the sense that in the US, again, not just related to our kind of technology, but whether that's genetically modified foods or new forms of medical treatments, that the US has a much more kind of let's try it out, allow people to do something approach. And then if it turns out to be risky, we'll step in and regulate it. In Europe, I think we are much, much more inclined to can you prove it's safe before we let you do it? And I say genetically modified foods is sort of a different kind of technology, and people may have very strong views on it. But you see that marked difference between the two approaches. The EU will say we'll have a moratorium until we've done years of tests so we can prove this stuff is safe, and the US will sort of just go for it, and then may course correct later on. So again, critical in these debates is understanding where you're coming from, understanding your risk tolerance, and I've had those discussions, I'm sure you have, where you're coming from these different perspectives. You're saying, look, there's this wonderful thing we can build. We would be foolish not to build it. And you're talking to somebody who thinks, well, there's a 3% chance that it could go wrong. We would be really foolish to build it. And so you're coming from a completely different approach. You're seeing the same technology through completely different lenses because you have these different approaches to risk. And I suspect most of us who've gone to work for innovative companies, particularly sort of US Silicon Valley companies, we're in the, hey, take some risk and then fix things later camp. We're often dealing with other people who are in the, please prove it safe before you go ahead camp. And that's a crucial distinction, I think.
Yeah, it's almost there are whiffs there of a Kantian versus utilitarian, a sort of a deontological versus a teleological ethic, right? So you're sort of thinking about outcomes and you're calculating what you think can be the net benefit. And there are people who just say there are certain things you absolutely cannot do. Yeah. You have a duty not to do them. And I think there's a really interesting difference. I think that to a very large degree, tech policy in the European Union has a Kantian flavor to it, which is paradoxical because Kant also told us to sapere aude, dare to know, right? Go forth and be enlightened and explore the world. But there's this sort of, but there are certain things you shouldn't do. The sort of categorical imperative is distantly related with the precautionary principle. So I think there's something there that's quite interesting too. Now, one of the other things that's really interesting with Lessig is that Lessig's model is not only is it sort of static in the sense that these four regulatory forces are working on the regulated object or on society at the same time, and he doesn't discuss much how there is like a flow between them, but he also doesn't discuss the longitudinal dimension, how is this changing over time? Because if you look at, for example, the 17th century or the 18th century, you could argue that there was almost no architectural power, but there was tons of legislative power, a little bit of market power, and a little bit of normative power. But the balance between these regulators over time has shifted a lot, which means that, as we are thinking about the longer future and speculating about what the world will look like in 20 or 30 years, you have to ask the question, will we be able still to translate the kind of architectural power we're creating in technology into market power norms and legislation? Or will that be increasingly hard as the complexity of technology increases and the ungovernability of technology increases? Is the long arc of the 4 regulators that Lessig lays out actually weighted towards code? And should we expect code to regulate more and more, even though there is persistent calls for more of an equilibrium between the regulators?
Yeah. So I think some of the forces have been there. I mean, when they built the railway system or the canal system, way back when, or even the turnpike road systems that allow people to travel, these were sort of architectural changes that had profound impacts. The code of transport changed over time, or when they introduced different forms of technology for making cloth. Printing press is the other sort of example. So there have always been examples, but I think there are 2 crucial differences now. One is the speed. So many of these changes took place over decades, so there was time for the law to catch up. And now these changes are happening so fast. And that I think that, again, having sat on both sides, there's this massive disjuncture between the speed at which the code moves and the speed at which legislation moves. And again, they come back to our favorite cookie example. I'm sure that people were worried about cookies actually at the beginning of when they first started appearing, but it took 4 or 5 years to translate those worries into legislation, by which time the technology had become firmly established. And so we're continually seeing this sort of time gap. So legislation is slow, and we need to figure out a way to legislate things that are fast moving. That is going to have to be different. It's hugely challenging for legislators. Again, do they rush into it? It's one way. Do they do quick legislation? But generally speaking, rushed legislation is seen as poor legislation, and that's been experienced in many fields. Do they create some kind of forum where they engage as legislators but don't actually write anything down for 2 or 3 years? And I'd argue that's sort of what's happened around the terrorism content. They have not rushed to legislate, but they have not been disengaged. They've been engaged throughout the process as things are developing through that. That's another model. Another model is cede more to the executive. So the legislation becomes framework legislation. It says, the government has the power to regulate financial services, but the primary legislation, which is the thing that's slow, doesn't try and spell out how you're going to regulate financial services. That's left to the executive to make much quicker decisions. And we see some of that in the latest privacy regulation, the General Data Protection Regulation. There's a number of hooks in there for the Commission and other data protection bodies to kind of take faster action than going back to a 3 or 4 year legislative process. So speed, absolutely critical, and say that I think has not been fully worked out yet. How does law work with fast moving technologies? And then the second crucial one is this geography question, which again comes up in the code book and comes up repeatedly, and we've discussed repeatedly that old-fashioned rollouts of technology, I'd argue in some senses they certainly are driving countries to adopt them. So it's interesting that no country in the world has rejected technologies like the motor vehicle. So there are technologies that are so compelling that everyone's going to adopt them, but the adoption can be regulated within national boundaries. So when people adopt the motor car, there's physical stuff happening, and if a government wishes to regulate it, they can do so. With a lot of the internet services, it's almost like, everybody is adopting the motor car, which has a profound impact on your society. But it's all coming from outside. There's no way that you can control it at your borders. So those are I think the two really profound questions for legislators. The first being speed, how to keep up with the technology, and the second being geography, how to deal with people adopting a technology essentially that's being beamed into your country where you have very little ability to manage anything at the border or control it geographically.
I think I would add complexity to that, because I
Yeah.
think that as it becomes harder and harder to understand these technological systems, it's going to be harder and harder to regulate them as well. And I think that's
generously assuming that our policymakers will get to grips with the complexity. So that's sort of an assumption on my part. Yeah.
Yes, well, I think that these systems increasingly will be complex enough even for their engineers not to be fully transparent. So it will be more tricky. But sort of what it suggests over time is that there is going to be more and more power situated in code as new technologies come faster, as they're rolled out in a way that makes it hard to regulate them geographically, as I think at least they're more complex, and that could then turn to I mean, if we see the kinds of responses that we're seeing early signs of right now in European legislation, one of the instincts there is to go ex ante, to say, okay, we have to approve these technologies before they are actually released into the market. It's sort of it's go directly to law, skip norms and market, and if you cannot sort of get approval, we're not going to let this happen. Which means that the model for technology regulation risks morphing a little bit more with the model of pharmacological research or the pharma industry. Are there different kinds of regulatory regimes like that you think that the technology industry will evolve into?
So I think you're right that will be the import controls are the way that governments can really assert control. They're not licensing something for import. And again, the assumption of the mid-90s and the original cyberspace independence declaration was that you could not apply import controls to the internet or to cyberspace. And one thing I think that we're increasingly seeing, and we've discussed before, is through things like app stores in particular, you can very much, I think now, certainly steer a national market. There may be holes, there may be routes round for enterprising people to get around any kind of import control, but you can apply pretty broad brush import controls, particularly if you're controlling, for example, a government could say, we want to approve certain types of apps before they get into the Android and iOS app store for use in my country. And that will actually have quite a significant effect for the vast majority of their population who just use standard app stores on standard devices. Say others will get round, but it's a pretty strong import control. So I think that is one area they're looking at, and however you want to describe it, that's how it is. So it's effectively saying, you cannot bring my technology into this country, into my country, without my permission. And that may be a tool that governments increasingly want to use. It then does beg the question, how do they do that assessment, and how do they manage to, I guess, not just from a technical point of view, but from a sort of fairness and keeping in touch with the norms of their population, how do they effectively decide what comes in and out, or what's allowed in and what's not allowed in? Again, come back to something like end-to-end encrypted services. It would be relatively straightforward from a legal perspective for a government to say we're prohibiting this range of services from being offered in app stores for people in our country. If the people in the country desperately want to use those services and they're using them en masse, that potentially creates a conflict between law and norms that government would have to resolve. So import controls, I think, are an interesting tool, but they don't sort of act as a way of completely avoiding or voiding, rather than avoiding, voiding these other forces, because I'd argue that where a government applies an import control that's against the established norms of their population's internet usage, they're going to face a challenge. And so these are the dynamics, I think, that are going to play out. But the new tool on the block is this notion, which I think was inconceivable in the 1990s, that, as I can say, governments in open countries, open societies, would seek to restrict applications on the basis of law, local law. That was something that was associated only with governments in closed societies, but now is being something increasingly considered by governments in open societies.
I think that it's really interesting. I think the other aspect of that I'd like to highlight is that I think when law and norms get into conflict, that actually generates new code.
Yeah.
We see it most clearly in the copyright case, where the normative view of copyright was very different than the legal view, and you could see the evolution of peer-to-peer networks, etc., BitTorrent. And I think that this is the other way that these different regulators act together. When there's a conflict between, for example, law and norms, it creates a vacuum into which code will step, or markets will step. And I think that's another thing that we'll probably see more of. And I don't think, if there's something that you could not fault Lessig for, but you would like to see more from him, I think, is this question of the interplay between the regulators as they come into conflict with each other, because I think there's a great deal to be done there. Now, in wrapping up, I thought it would be interesting to think about what in Lessig is it that we sort of feel or experience has changed the most. The model is still very fruitful to discuss, as we've done, and the model, that sort of the central model of his work. But what is it that feels most out of date? I think I have two candidates for you, and I'm interested in what you think. The first one is this notion of code in the singular, which I still feel is not the way that architecture work. I think architecture is polycentric. There are several different models of architecture, and they are competing with each other, which means that you will have an open source solution, you will have a decentralized network, and that's going to continue and be driven even more by conflicts between the other regulators. The second is the dualism. I think that when we read Lessig today, it feels almost quaint to read about cyberspace as this sort of special domain. I think almost all tech policy today starts from a much more monistic ontology, if you will, where there's a society and technology exists in that society as an integral part of it, not as a specific domain. And I think that will be even more true for the future. Those are the two things where I feel that as you read Lessig today, you read it through a different lens. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, your second one I really like. And I think he revisited it himself, didn't he, in, I think, 2006 with Code 2 to sort of reflect on that. I think we've learned that is the key lesson that we've learned, that the internet is not other. Cyberspace is not a different space. Everything on the internet itself and everything that flows across it, these are human artifacts. The endpoints have people either physically present or controlling and designing those endpoints. And so this otherness, I think, is the thing that has really changed over time. But I think that was a very current view in the 1990s. It was a very common view. It's a very optimistic view in a lot of ways, or idealistic view. But I think now we are seeing that, the internet does not exist outside of ourselves. It is part of our daily lives. And therefore needs, when you come to think about regulating it, you're actually thinking about regulating our daily lives. You're thinking about regulating things like discrimination, whereas in the AI example earlier, or law enforcement surveillance. When we think about end-to-end encryption, these are, or the advertising market, when you're thinking about cookies. So we express them as regulating technologies. They're not. They're regulating human activities that take place through the medium of technology. And when you think of it in those terms, of course they're going to be regulated. Why would human activity, because it's enabled by technology, sort of be outside of any framework that we would otherwise have for regulating a human activity? So that's where we're going. I think that's where we are, and I think that is the thing for me that sort of, when I look back to everything that was written sort of in the 90s in this space, that I think has changed most profoundly is that mainstreaming and that understanding it's just part of everything we do.
I like that. I think that's a pretty profound change as well. That you're not regulating technology, you're regulating human action. You're not regulating a new space, you're regulating use. And I think that's a very strong, good point for us to end this classic session on. I hope you have enjoyed our reading or misreading of Larry Lessig, and there will be more of these sessions. You can find the podcast at Rich's website, which is
www.regulate.tech.
And as always, any comments, thoughts, or ideas that you have, please send them our way. We love getting them, and we hope to have you with us next week. Thank you very much.